Today at the National Press Club, a debate on Australia's housing crisis. Greens MP Max Chandler-Mather and the Chief Executive of the Property Council, Mike Zorbas, on what needs to change to get more Australians affordable housing. That's today at the National Press Club.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for today's Westpac address. My name is David Crowe, the Chief Political Correspondent at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and a Director here at the Club. Our guests today are Max Chandler-Mather and Mike Zorbas, two people with very different views on one of the biggest issues that Australians are facing right now, which is housing. Mr Chandler-Mather is the Greens spokesman on housing. He comes to the National Press Club today with a major new policy on housing, which he says could result in the construction of many more homes and lead to help for people who cannot afford their rents. He's made a big impact in the housing debate in just a few years. He entered Parliament at the last election and won the seat of Griffith in Queensland from Labor with a swing of 11%. His life story has been covered in various profiles, but a quick recap: he grew up in Brisbane from a Labor household, and he was a Labor Party member until 2013, when he quit the party and joined the Greens, and I guess it's fair to say it's just been all the way up ever since then. Mr Zorbas is the Chief Executive of the Property Council of Australia, the peak group that represents builders and developers like Lendlease, Mirvac, Dexus, Goodman, Stockland. Before his appointment as the Chief Executive, he was the Head of Government and Media and Industry Affairs at Lendlease, and before that he was the Head of Strategy at Grocon, and going a little further back, he was the Manager of Government Relations at Stockland. So he's been a regular visitor to federal Parliament on housing and commercial property for many years. So two very informed speakers today on this big issue. We have two speakers, not the usual one address that we've had most often. So we'll hear first from Mr Zorbas, Mr Zorbas, who will speak for about 14 minutes. Then we'll hear from Mr Chandler-Mather for about 14 minutes, and that will open the way for questions from the journalists that we've got assembled here today. For those of you watching at home, you can join the conversation on X, where our handle is @PressClubAust, and you can use the hashtag NPC. Please welcome Max Chandler-Mather and Mike Zorbas, and first up, please welcome Mr Zorbas to kick us off.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I haven't had as busy a morning as Max, but I hope through the course of the next 15 minutes or so to give you a little bit of an insight into what has crossed my mind, not only this year but over many years, about housing. Our national housing aspiration, our task, must be to give as many people access to housing and to the hope of owning a home as possible. However we hope to get there, I hope that we can all agree on that. Why is this important? Because housing sits at the heart of our social contract with each other and is ultimately essential to our long-term social cohesion. My belief is that government-industry partnership focused on supply is the rock, the paper and the scissors of solving the housing crisis. I'll share our 9-point plan for better housing to open, but in speaking today, I first acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this beautiful city that I have loved for a lifetime, the Ngunnawal and Ngambirri peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching today. Hat tip also to my friends and mentors in the room. Thank you. This will be a more sober address than you're used to. And also to those charitable housing partners of ours who are watching, including the Property Industry Foundation and Homes for Homes, and not-for-profit allies like the Building 4.0 CRC, CHIA, the Architects, Power Housing Australia, and Housing All Australians. Thank you. If my kids are watching, it's a school day, Mum and Dad don't approve. Given timing things, I won't address in this speech, but they do go to the heart of housing affordability, high cost and hurdles of financing, bad weather impacts, rising material and labour costs, decreasing construction capacity and productivity, unprecedented new household formation since the 2016 census, accelerated by the pandemic, low market capacity, labour market competition from welcome and historically large state and green infrastructure big builds. All of these are factors that combine to add cost to new housing for buyers, renters and people that need social housing. And having laid that out, I now move to a warning. There will be 4 million more people here by 2034. That is 3 Adelaides. And so my warning to every level of government and every parliamentarian is this: grandstanding, gridlock and policy grenades are not going to house anyone. They won't put a roof over anyone's head. And so the Property Council's 9-point sustainable housing plan, clearly overlaying that with the need for increased energy efficiency and planning for a changing climate, is a combination of actions that we have never properly tried as a nation. The plan. 1. When it comes to the 1.2 million new homes national housing target, I must admit I'm quite tired of hearing people decry that. This is the time where we shouldn't be whinging about whether or not we're going to make the target, but we should genuinely partner to have a serious crack at 1.2. We've never done it before as a nation. Now is the time. 2, improve our broken state planning systems. 3, with government taxes making up 20 to 40% of the cost of every single new home in Australia as built, the nation needs to have government stop randomly increasing taxes and investment in new projects, taxes on investment in new projects each quarter in our big states, especially in Victoria and New South Wales. 4, we need to back in the government's industry training and complement this with additional skilled construction trades from overseas as part of a smaller overall intake. 5, more modular and prefab construction. 6, starting to use the airspace over existing buildings as a first resort for new development, which goes to circular economy considerations. 7, we've got to grow the types of housing choice at different stages of life. Let's fix the investment settings for the best kinds of communities: purpose-built student accommodation, retirement living, and build-to-rent housing. All of these aggregate government services and result in billions of dollars of saving for government into the future. 8, consider the role of regional towns and growth corridors in our planning. And 9, spend more of the monumental property taxes we all pay nationally on social and affordable housing, while supporting the vast bulk of the market that is always going to be customer-led. Now, those 9 points are derived from the collective expertise of 2,500 of the largest and leading organisations that the Property Council represents. While the Property Council has better planning and smarter investment frameworks as our bread and butter, I should note we're also known for shaping sustainability and diversity leadership and outcomes across the industry. The last time that the Property Council got the call up to speak here was 20 years ago under my friend and mentor, Peter Verwer, who I know is watching. These challenges inherent in shaping our cities and communities for the better, the very purpose of the Property Council of Australia over 55 years, have arguably intensified since he spoke here. For my own part, I've been attending the National Press Club since 1998, when at Dad's insistence I started working in a property company for the late great Jim Service. A self-made property person, it was Jim who taught me that the creation of the built environment requires all the problem-solving skills that we as humans possess, from conception and design, through consultation and placemaking, to construction and operation. Equally, Jim taught me that the most challenging thing about bringing projects to life in Australia is making the finances and the management of risks and delays, and ultimately the affordability of the end product, work in a marketplace that is mired in the quicksand of Australia's relentlessly unproductive planning regimes and ever-changing taxation systems. Parenthetically, WA's recent planning reforms will hopefully make that state an exception to this. The stark reality Jim showed me is that even after the headline approval has been given to any property project, the money invested through the developer by banks, by individuals, by super funds, by overseas and domestic capital partners must be then risked against approval processes that are far more complicated than the measurement of one-off approval indicates in public data. There was a terrific case study of this in the Sydney Morning Herald on the weekend by architect Tone Wheeler near the Prime Minister's own electorate that well describes the inner city planning challenges that will directly add, in that case, $8,000 per dwelling to future renters' bills. We obviously can and must do better. Suffice to say, much of this planning process is necessary. All of this planning process, especially agency and utility overlays and bottlenecks, could be more efficient. And of course, some plain vanilla planning should be deemed to comply more often than not. Then there are investment repelling gimmicks like the ACT's developer licensing regime. But looking past those broken planning systems, it is important to note that NIMBYism, that is to say, people who don't want things built in their backyard, a vocal minority in most cases, is by no means always an irrational state. But being inherently a local movement, it often does not, cannot, and will not consider what's in the broader interest, which is exactly the level at which decision-making on housing must occur. The greater good of the suburb, of people who may wish to move to the suburb, of grandchildren who would benefit from living near their grandparents before they go through the various stages of their own lives, of nurses needing to work at nearby hospitals, teachers needing to work at local schools, and if we're to do this right, we must consider the greater good, the shared opportunity and social cohesion of the region, the territory, state and our country as a whole. Back to Jim. More eloquently than I do now, he helped me understand there are no hospitals, there are no schools, universities, stadia, factories, office towers, shopping centres, data centres. There are no warehouses for storing and moving goods, no retirement living communities, no special purpose-built student accommodation, no social rental or owner-occupier homes. There is none of that without the work of the property industry. In fact, every year the property industry contributes about $130 billion worth of taxes in all levels of government, more than 18% of the country's total tax receipts. The property industry directly supports more than 1.4 million full-time jobs, up to 3 million if you think about indirect support. That's more than the mining, manufacturing and financial services sector combined. Those millions of Australians work in the only development system that is long-term compatible with liberal democracy, a designed and competitive market for the 97% of non-social housing that will always need to provide adequate choices for our many phases of life and differing individual needs. Those 3 million people are the champions of the solution to our housing supply and availability crisis. I'm going to pick this up a little bit here. What then is the challenge ahead of us all? Luckily, we're blessed with a trifecta of housing supply advantages as good as any on this earth. We are the 55th largest national population in the world, not very big. We are, depending on the cycles, the 12th to 15th largest national economy, sizable enough. We are the 6th largest nation by land mass, spoiled for land then, even if much of it is arid. Given this trifecta, that million or 1.2 million homes by 2029, our National Cabinet agreed target should and can be a modest target in a land-rich and affluent nation. And yet, by all public measures, anywhere, Australia is one of the global supply wooden spooners. Perhaps the most dire analysis I've come across is that of ex-RBA economist Tony Richards in the AFR in May last year, showing our national housing supply performance over 20-year periods, successively to 2021, has our housing delivery systems, especially planning in our cities, in steep decline as the going gets tougher. He found that our housing supply productivity has slumped radically compared to the turn of the century and concluded that we are confronting 1.3 million homes behind where we should be over the last 20 years in overall housing supply. If you add that to the Leptos review, 290 billion at large in terms of the spend on social and key worker housing over the next 20 years. These are big challenges. No wonder the New South Wales Productivity Commission boss said a month ago that Sydney could become a city without grandchildren. No wonder Peter also previously restated that a 10% increase in national housing supply could drive down costs by 25%, drive down the price of new homes by 25%. You read that and you weep. How did we get here? Our housing supply deficit is largely born of the failure of past state cabinets, past governments and past parliaments to hold themselves or local governments to account for productive housing delivery over the past 2 decades. Property taxes are the lion's share of the large state budgets, and yet we've chosen not to hypothecate, not to spend enough of that money on delivering social, affordable and even at-market housing from those consolidated revenues. To be clear, most people that go into public life at federal, state and local levels of government do so to improve the country and may well be qualified to do that. Personally, I do admire that difficult choice. Equally, it is no insult, rather a fact, that precious few parliamentarians or councillors know anything about how to fund or deliver the creation or renewal of cities on assuming office. It is a steep learning curve, even for politicians that are a quick study. And historically, on housing supply deficits, some of the same representatives have tended to shift the blame to any other available level of government, which may be true, to negative gearing, which actually supports new supply and enables upkeep of existing supply, to the excesses of a customer-driven market, where the inconvenient truth is actually rent freezing is a stone-cold supply killer that directly reduces new housing funding and production, as no less than the Brookings Institute tells us. To land banking, a quick look under the hood shows claims of land banking are an evidence-free zone, as these cash flow-oriented businesses owe the bank and their investors, and always with interest. And finally, many of our past leaders were all for housing supply, provided, of course, that it was one suburb over. So that is a key part of the origin story of many of our housing problems, but let's not do whinging only about it. Let's merely name it and move on. Let's hit those 1.2 million home National Cabinet targets as driven by the Prime Minister, by Treasurer Chalmers, by Minister Collins. Let's make sure that we achieve what the Grattan Institute thinks will reduce rent by $32 billion and realise that hitting those targets involves an unprecedented parliamentary and business partnership going forward. Out of courtesy, I also note the work of Shadow Minister Sukkar in establishing NIFIC and deploying HomeBuilder when it was needed, and the ongoing work of he and Senator Bragg and colleagues in attempting to aid scale investment in new housing in recent thin cap debates. Only if we hit the targets can we achieve smarter and more sustainable planning, stable investment welcoming tax settings and intelligently manage our overall migration intake while increasing the absolute number of people with construction skills in and coming to Australia. And so in closing, the paramount idea I leave with you is the grand housing partnership. It needs especially state parliaments to publicly commit to and hold to account their treasuries and their planning systems, to deliver better supply and choice of housing to a changing and ageing population at a scale and an affordability level that we've failed to manage in the past. This unprecedented era of partnership is needed across parliaments, not just National Cabinet, not just premiers, treasurers and planning ministers, but all parliamentarians, with industry and the profit purpose sector to fix our capital and regional cities and solve the structural causes of the housing crisis which will otherwise dog us into the next century. Let's take advantage of our talent. Let's amplify our natural advantages. Let's create the right approval systems and champion housing and building our cities project by project, not just the productive physical bricks and mortar that we need, but the social infrastructure that the nation needs. The final call to action is simple. Let's give solving the housing crisis a crack together.
That was 15 minutes and it was like, world's best practice. And I'm sorry to hear that it's been 20 years since your organisation has been here at the National Press Club.
We're hoping to return soon.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And please welcome Max Chandler-Mather to the podium now.
Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of the land, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that we're meeting on stolen land. Also acknowledge the brilliant leader of the Australian Greens, Adam Band, and other dignitaries here today. Last weekend, I door-knocked a single mum in a private rental in my electorate of Griffith. She had just copped a massive rent increase that left her having to skip meals just so she could afford her baby's nappy rash cream. Just 4 days ago, I spoke to a young couple who are facing eviction after copping a $150 a week rent increase. They couldn't afford that, so the landlord was evicting them. If they don't find a home by March 13th, they'll be homeless. Every Monday night, my office helps run a free dinner for people sleeping rough in West End under Kurilpa Bridge. Like many places across Australia, tent cities have appeared, often under the glaring lights of newly built apartment towers. Serving meals, I've met young men and women who should be looking forward to transitioning to adulthood and looking towards the rest of their lives. Instead, they are beaten down, their horizons restricted to where they'll sleep tonight and where they'll find their next meal. I've spoken to couples in their 30s living with their parents trying to save for a home, only to find house prices have increased so fast that what they thought they had for a deposit and what they needed had actually increased out of reach. I've spoken to parents deeply worried about how their kids will ever be able to find a home or buy a home, anxiously trying to work out how they can scrimp together enough money to help out. These stories are playing out across Australia because the housing system in Australia is broken and it is breaking people. On one end of the spectrum, overwhelmed homelessness services turned away over 57,000 people last year who needed assistance. CoreLogic reports that the median national weekly rent surpassed $600 a week for the first time in Australian history. That means someone earning $104,000 a year would be in rental stress. For first home buyers, the income required to buy an average home in a capital city in Australia is now $187,000. That is more than double the median national salary, more than double a new teacher or nurse's salary. Those who are lucky enough to buy their first home have had to go into so much debt that recent increases to interest rates are pushing far too many to the brink. In the last decade alone, house prices have doubled, while rents are increasing at close to double the rate of wages. Rather than provide affordable housing, the Australian housing system has been designed to drive up the cost of housing, generating enormous wealth for the few and increasing rents, house prices and mortgages for the many. I want to be clear about this. For decades now, federal and state government housing policy has been explicitly geared towards turbocharging house prices and driving up rents and putting billions of dollars in the pockets of property investors, property developers and the banks. Here are just three key design features. 1. Governments from both Labor and the Liberals for decades now have cut funding for and then chronically underfunded public and community housing. In my electorate, the Queensland Labor government sold off 41 public homes onto the private market in only a few years, and over 1,000 public homes sold off across the state in just a few years. Now there is a shortage of over 750,000 homes, public homes, across the country. This in turn puts more pressure on the private rental market. The Howard government's introduction of the capital gains tax discount combined with negative gearing to turbocharge house prices by putting billions of dollars in government tax handouts in the pockets of property investors who use that money to massively bid up the price of housing. In fact, the biggest line item in the most recent federal Labor budget for housing was not for public housing, not for renters, it was for tax handouts for property investors. All up, Labor will spend $500 billion on property investor tax concessions, tax handouts, over the decade. This has turned housing from a place to build a good life into a lucrative financial asset for property investors. The result, where house prices used to grow on average at about the same rate as wages, since the introduction of the capital gains tax discount, house prices have increased close to 3 times that of wages every year. 3. As a result of Labor and the Liberals' disastrous sell-off and underfunding of public housing, private property developers have a near monopoly control over the supply of housing. This was a deliberate policy choice and it has been disastrous. The property industry has used their dominant position to wield enormous influence over the political system. Indeed, the Labor government is so captured by the property industry that their only new solution to the housing crisis this year is a scheme that will further drive up the price of housing. The government's so-called Help to Buy scheme, which will screw over the 99.8% of renters who don't get access to it every year, will drive up the price of housing. Meanwhile, Labor has appointed the outgoing CEO of one of Australia's largest property developers, Mirvac, as the head of their Supply and Affordability Council. This is the body that's meant to advise the government on housing affordability. So I don't think we should be surprised that Labor's only real solution to the housing crisis, the National Housing Accord, when it boils down, is basically giving more money and power to private property developers. Relying on private property developers to tackle the housing crisis is sort of like relying on Coles and Woolies not to rip us off. They helped create the crisis in the first place, and they have no interest in fixing it. For starters, let's talk about build-to-rent. Private build-to-rent. Mr. Zorba, CEO of the Property Council, will talk about private build-to-rent. But what he won't tell you is that property developers will often only do build-to-rent when they can charge premium rents. Property Council member Mervac has bragged about the fact that the rent on their build-to-rent apartments are on average 15 to 20% higher than market rents. And just a reminder, the outgoing CEO of Mervac is now the head of Labor's body meant to advise on housing affordability. Or what about the private build-to-rent down in Melbourne, where 1/3 of tenants receive rent increases or notices to vacate? One of the tenants found their 2-bedroom apartment that they were told to vacate in November has been relisted, with the rental price rising by $205 a week to $975 a week. That's private build-to-rent. Indeed, the great lie at the heart of Australia's housing debate is that private property developers want housing to be more affordable. What private property developers want to do, understandably, they're a private business, is make as much money as possible. That means doing everything they can to drive up the price of housing, land and rents. Labor and their friends in the Property Council claim that developers will build more homes if only Council approved more developments faster and we handed over more public land. But when rents and house prices are high, property developers make money. They're not interested in building enough homes, and if they ever accidentally get close to doing so, they scrap projects, drip feed supply, and even keep new apartments sitting empty. Australia's largest developers own tens of thousands of development-ready sites for houses and apartments, but only ever release a small portion of it every year. For instance, AV Jennings, a large Australian developer, has 14,000 lots in the pipeline, including, get this, 11,000 already zoned or approved for homes. They sold 732 last year. To quote an article in the AAP in 2019, Peter Summers, Chief Executive of AV Jennings, is now looking to slow supply as the market turns sour. To quote him directly, in a couple of projects, we've already reduced our stage sizes and delayed a couple of stages, he said. In other words, because house price growth was slowing, AV Jennings decided to slow down the supply of housing. For example, another example, Meriton founder and managing director, Mr. Harry Triguboff, who when talking to the Australian newspaper, explaining why he wasn't selling as many apartments as he could, said, and I quote, "I'm holding a lot more than I am selling at the moment, and as the value of property goes up, the value of what I have kept rises." We will never stop the crazy growth in house prices while the private property development industry holds a monopoly over the supply of housing. While governments rely on private property developers, we will never fix the housing crisis. Right now, the Greens are the only party in Parliament with a plan that will actually make housing affordable. It has 3 key pillars. First, we need to scrap the massive tax handouts for property investors, denying millions of renters the chance to buy a home. Want to know why you or your son or your daughter can't buy a home? Well, because property investors can rock up to an auction and use their access to massive government tax handouts from the Labor Party to bid up the price of housing. Renters far too often don't stand a chance. Phasing out negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount will save the budget billions of dollars we could invest in building public and community housing, while finally giving renters a chance to buy their first home. Secondly, we need to end the barbaric cruelty of unlimited rent increases. How can we have a situation where 1/3 of this country who rents has absolutely no control or any idea how much they'll be paying in housing costs in the next 12 months? On a whim, a landlord can increase the rent by $200 a week at the end of a lease, and outside of the ACT, there is nothing a renter can do about that. We need a national 2-year freeze on rent increases, followed by a long-term cap on rent increases of 2% every 2 years. Last year, under pressure from the Greens, the Prime Minister chaired a national cabinet meeting to discuss national renters' rights. They had the power to put an end to unlimited rent increases. Instead, they chose property investors, like the Prime Minister, and threw renters under the bus. Finally, I'm proud today to announce the Greens' first policy for the next federal election, a public property developer. The Greens will scrap tax handouts for property investors that are denying millions of renters the chance to buy a home, and instead invest money in building hundreds of thousands of good quality homes to be sold and rented at prices people can actually afford. The public property developer will save a renter, on average, participating in the scheme, $5,200 a year on their rent, and a first home buyer $260,000 on the price of a home by cutting out the profit margin and building good quality homes for people the way governments used to. Under the Greens plan, the public developer would build 360,000 good quality homes over the next 5 years, representing about 30% of Australia's existing construction capacity, and 610,000 homes over the decade, in addition to whatever the private sector is going to build. The public developer would employ its own town planners, architects, project managers, and get the government back in the business of building good homes. Homes would be sold at just over the cost of construction, while rents would be capped at 25% of household income. Unlike public housing today that heavily restricts access based on incomes, the homes would be available to anyone who wants to rent and anyone who doesn't already own a home. In this way, teachers will be living next door to pensioners, doctors next door to hospo workers, a nurse next door to a cleaner. Exactly the sort of diverse and welcoming communities we should be fostering. It would prioritise good quality medium density apartments and would sit under a new federal Department of Sustainable Cities, Development and Housing to ensure developments are integrated with public parks, public transport, schools and hospitals. Work by the public developer would be informed by innovative projects such as the design principles of the Nightingale model. This could include incorporating rooftop gardens, 8-star energy ratings, and other design principles that save on construction costs, like removing basement car parks where the developments are adjacent to public and active transport. These will be homes people really want to live in. The public developer would directly compete with private developers and break their monopoly over the supply of housing. As a society, we have decided that health and education are essentials for people to live a good life. So we provide a public option for people to access them. But imagine if Australia only had private schools and hospitals, and they could charge as much as they wanted. What do we think would happen to the price of health and education? Well, the same thing is happening with housing. And the Greens believe, and we do not apologise for this, a roof over your head is just as important to building a good life as access to health and education. Where private property developers sit on vacant land or homes to try and drive up prices, the public property developer will just keep building good quality homes. Where a private developer prioritises profits, the public developer will prioritise good, quality, medium density apartments people can actually afford. The Parliamentary Budget Office, once taking into account rental and sales revenue, has said this plan would cost the underlying cash balance $27.9 billion over the decade. For context, just this year alone, the federal budget will spend $39 billion in 1 year on tax handouts for property investors. Meanwhile, private housing construction starts have reached a 10-year low, freeing up construction materials and skills that could be put to work building public homes. This plan is entirely possible, but what it requires is political will. And right now we have a Labor Party where 75% of its politicians own investment properties, led by a property investor Prime Minister who is refusing to scrap tax handouts that benefit property investors to the tune of billions of dollars, while trying to rely entirely on property developers, private ones, to fix a crisis they helped create. The housing and rental crisis is breaking people, but to fix it will require more than tinkering around the edges of the status quo. And everything I have proposed today in some form has been done in Australia before, in particular post-World War II. And the only difference between then and now is Australia is a much wealthier country today than it ever has been in the 20th century. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for your opening remarks. We've got plenty of journalists here to ask questions. I'll kick off. I'm very interested in the Greens' proposal today. I think it shakes up the debate. However, At the moment, we've got shortages of labour, we've got high prices for building materials, and a quick check of the costings there suggests you're assuming a relatively low cost to the federal taxpayer per home built. I mean, what work have you done on whether it's even possible to build that number of dwellings in addition to what the private sector is already doing anyway with, I take it, an organisation, the public developer, that would have to be built from scratch? How would that work? And Mike, I'm very interested in your view of whether that Greens proposal could work.
Well, look, I wouldn't be surprised if the Property Council was against this, because this is a public developer competing with private developers to help drive down prices. In the same way Coles and Woolies would be against the idea of more competition. To be very clear, what we know is one of the big drawdowns and drags on housing supply right now is the cost of finance. To translate that for people, that's how much profit a developer can make when they take into account the cost of finance. We've just seen today on national accounts a 3.8% decline in residential housing investment in a quarter. Now, what that is doing is freeing up materials and skills that we could put to work building good quality public homes. One of the big problems with our construction industry is that it's a boom and bust cycle. And far too often, and in the past, federal governments used to smooth that out by investing in hundreds of thousands of good quality public homes. And Australia's faced this issue before, right? So post-World War II, we had shortages of construction materials and skills. We had a low supply of housing. And what did the government do? In the first year after World War II, 27% of all homes built were built by the government. It's entirely possible to do, and all we need is the political will.
But just to check, you are saying scale up a totally new agency with new staff and so forth, and hiring the builders in order to do that construction.
That's right. And this is a housing crisis, David. I mean, we should have ambition.
I get the problem. It's just a question of how the solution would work. So, Mike, what's your view?
I don't think anyone has ever solved a housing crisis by adding another government agency on top of existing government agencies. Housing Australia is a perfectly serviceable vehicle for any parliamentary endeavour. There's the National Housing Supply Council, and Sue Lloyd-Hurwitz, who runs that, is actually incredibly good at, not only insight into, the housing market, but also looking at innovative solutions. So I think those things are already set up. The other thing I would say is this: if you're going to nationalise housing, and I know that Max has brought his own model, you want a better outcome from the Public Budget Office than, essentially a grade of uncertain implementation. That's what they've given. And when you listen to Grattan this morning, they're talking about it as a giant lottery. I mean, this does not sound like a sound basis.
Okay, but Max did make the point that after World War II, there was massive public investment in housing. There was a different approach. Yes, things have been privatised since then, but doesn't that show that in a different era, for a different generation, a public ownership model did actually work?
What that shows is that the state governments who would otherwise have been doing that over the last 50 or 60 years haven't been investing in housing. Now, they're getting these enormous cash inflows, these enormous taxes coming from the property and development sector, and they're not hypothecating those to social housing. So I can't see the dystopia that Max is putting here in relation to those state governments. What I can see is incompetence over time. Sure.
I visited one of those dystopias, by the way, Mike. It was terrible, right? It was Vienna. It's an awful place. No one wants to go there. 60% of that city is some form of social housing. Australia has one of the most unaffordable, worst housing systems in the world, precisely because we rely on private property developers. I walked down the middle of that city in Vienna in 2019. There was beautiful public parks, beautiful public infrastructure, some of the best designed housing you will see, and because the government helps lead the build of housing. There are people in this room who probably grew up in Housing Commission here, who built their lives off it. And if you were born today, you would not have that opportunity, because when post-World War II, the government got into the business of building good homes, that gave you those opportunities. And many people today are being denied that because we have this logic that we should just give it to property developers.
That may be fair enough, but you just had two answers to my one question and Mike had one. So on that note, we'll go straight to the next question.
Yes, and I do want to rebut something that was just said there, because Max did totally mischaracterise what I was talking about, as I might have expected, as you were.
Okay, well, that's just an aside of...
I'll come back to it.
We'll leave that. The next question is from Tom McElroy.
Thanks, David. Tom McElroy from the Financial Review. Max, could I ask you please to discuss the workforce challenges with the new agency that you're talking about? The employment situation is very different from post-World War II in Australia right now. And could you also speak to the challenge that government has in delivering infrastructure routinely late over budget by years and billions of dollars?
Just on that first, there was a report done, I think by KPMG, so hardly friends of the Greens, who looked at the social housing initiative that the Rudd government rolled out. And do you know what they found? That what the government expected to spend on building public housing, well, it was less. They actually came in under budget. Because actually, when the government gets in the business of funding the construction of large projects like that, they can actually draw together economies of scale to bring down the cost of construction. On skills and materials, again, one of the problems with our construction industry is the boom and bust nature of it, which means that a lot of people come in and out of the industry. One of the ways to improve supply chains, improve the supply of skilled labour, is to say, hey guys, for the next 10 years, this is exactly how many homes the government's going to build, 610,000. And then they can make business decisions on that, open up new supply chains, train new workers. And on training, well, the Greens have said from time immemorial that we should be bringing back free university education and TAFE. We should be making sure that people have enough money to go and do that training, to have the student support payments to live off. There's a lot of things we can do in that space. And again, I can't emphasise this enough. There are countries around the world already doing this. And are we that small a nation, that's closed-minded, that we can't think we can do what Singapore's done, or what the Netherlands has done, or what Austria has done? I mean, I think we're a pretty good country, and we have a lot of skilled and talented and smart people. So let's put them to work doing the sort of things that we know have worked in the past in Australia and work overseas.
What do you think on that, Mike?
I think the only thing that Max and I agree on is the scale of the crisis and the fact that it's a national shame. I mean, we would talk about, boosting CRA, we'd talk about doubling...
Sorry, what's CRA?
Commonwealth Rent Assistance. We'd talk about doubling the Housing Australia Future Fund. But there is no chance that a privately funded developer doesn't have so many questions attached to how it would operate in the real world that you can get through those gates. And again, I just advert people's attention to the expert commentary that has lampooned this during the course of the morning, people who really do follow these things very closely, and the Parliamentary Budget Office's own report card for this, uncertain as to its implementation. I mean, it would seem that that is not a great position to start from.
Next question is from Tom Crowley.
Tom Crowley from ABC News. Thank you both for your speeches. Max, coming again to your policy, you mentioned just before that it's entirely possible to implement it. But as has been alluded to this morning, a number of questions have been raised as to how, and to name just a couple of those. Will the Commonwealth compulsorily acquire land? How will local planning objections be managed? How will bureaucrats choose between potentially thousands of applicants for a single house? How will mortgages be set? How would states agree to give up stamp duty? What is the constitutional basis for the Commonwealth? I don't expect you to answer all of those questions.
Do you want to extend by an hour?
But my question is that, these are the sorts of questions that governments have to answer if they want to legislate. You're not in government. And so my question is, how do you want us to treat this policy? Do you want us to treat it at the vibe level as a contribution to the debate of ideas? Or do you want us to treat it as something that could be legislated tomorrow? And if the latter, will we see a bill?
The point of the announcement today is to prove to the public that the government could go and do this. Not only do we have the money in the budget to fund it, not only do we have the example in the past where it has been done and worked, we also have other countries around the world who have done similar things. And I just note, of course, the Property Council, with respect, Mike, is going to be against this proposal. Because what we're saying is a public property developer will go into the market and compete against private developers. The last thing private developers will want is competition in the housing space that helps drive down rents and how it makes housing more affordable. I think one of the problems with the debate around housing is we don't look at who's saying, who the people that are making these criticisms are. Now, if Coles and Woolies was coming out and saying, the government's proposals on this are going to be terrible for supermarkets, people would rightly think, well, they want to make more money off supermarkets. That's the same thing for private property developers. They have an interest in making more money off housing. Now, I can't emphasise enough that if Australia can do something similar post-World War II, when we had much less wealth in this country, much fewer trained workers, and much less government capacity, of course we can do it now. And I think I would note that one of the things that the Parliamentary Budget Office has said is uncertain is the effect it would have on house prices and rents. Now, I think probably what would happen is it would slow down the increase in house prices and rents. Now, that's a good thing. Of course, the Property Council would be opposed to that because that means smaller profit margins for the Property Council.
Okay, and let's go to Mike and let's encourage quick answers because then there are about 5 other journalists we want to hear.
Totally. So I'm very interested in the magic pudding economics that Max is bringing out at this point. I mean, the property and construction sector is nothing like our relatively concentrated retail market. It is a highly fragmented industry. There are tens and thousands upon tens of thousands of separate businesses in that market. The largest members of the residential development sector that you can imagine all piled together would be a tiny fraction of the total number of homes built in every year. So to try and miscast an entire industry in that way shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the way in which the market works for housing in Australia.
Next question is from Nick Stewart.
Following Tom's question, Max, can you guarantee that if there was a balance of power at the next election, this would be a definite policy that the Greens would force in order to make sure that government continued?
Look, unless you'd like to join us in Greens party room to talk about strategy for balance of power, I'm not going to give that answer now.
Oh, happy to wander in, not to join, but just to listen.
Yeah.
And to both of you, there's been there are other ways of actually developing housing apart from just the old quarter-acre block. Do you see opportunities for example, for the government or for private industry to be boosting common ground properties, ideas that would work for people with disability, ideas that would work for marginalised people, unemployed people? And do you think, particularly with the property industry, that we will not get arguments about how big toilet doors should be so that they can be large enough for wheelchairs, rather than people saying, oh, we need to build all these houses quickly, so therefore we're going to dispense with those sort of regulations?
What about you first on that, Mike?
Sure. Yeah, look, I think, we obviously have to do more in that space. There's clearly always going to be a trade-off between the outcome and the cost of creating that outcome. So wherever you introduce some new specification that isn't a standard, you're going to have that balancing between the extra cost and the total cost to the consumer of the end product. So, you do have to think through those. I think as a nation, we could do that better at a percentage basis. Can I just take one other thing, David, because it has been said a couple of times here. Rent freezes. I just want to read something to you from...
I want to stay on
Do you want to
Nick's
okay,
question,
right, sorry, yeah.
and just give Max a chance to have a go.
You go.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I'd say about apartment and build quality is we have seen big problems with the quality of private construction and private property development. You only have to look at some of the stuff that's happened in Sydney. And I think one of the things, when you say look at the Nightingale model, that is a non-for-profit developer, or our proposal today, is you could go and do those innovative designs, you could go and do those things that improve apartment quality and might even save on construction costs, but you can do it much easier when your key motivator isn't making a massive profit. And in the same way that we can get really good public schools and really good public hospitals, although they do definitely need more funding at the moment, because their primary task is providing a quality education and quality healthcare. All we're saying is the same thing should be happening with housing as well.
Okay, now we'll go to the next question. And you were going to say something about rent freezes, but you did say in your opening remarks that they're a stone cold killer of investment in housing.
No, I want to read to you from global experts in urbanisation to tell you more about that.
Can we go to Kat Wong first for her next question? Thanks, Kat.
Thanks you two for your addresses. I'm Kat Wong from AAP. So there's been a lot of talk about making housing more affordable, but generally we talk about it in pretty nebulous terms. So I kind of want to nail that down. In the 1980s, the cost of a house was about 4 times an average salary. Now it's about 8 times an average salary. So what do you think the cost of a house should be in terms of multiples of income?
Mike? I can answer that, but I'm
Go on,
interested.
please. I'm curious.
We know that you're right. In the 1980s, it was about 3 to 4 times the price of a home. I think taken as a whole, the Greens policy, so phasing out tax handouts for property investors and a mass build of government homes, would at the very least stop the increases in house prices. Now, I know that Alan Kohler looked at this and said if you just slowed down and stop the increases in house prices, maybe it would take a few decades, but you could get back to that in a sustainable way without crashing the housing market. And I think that's a desirable outcome. But that's long term, over 10 to 20 years, done in a way that doesn't hurt mortgage holders and makes sure that we get to a stage of housing affordability that brings everyone along with us. And I would be interested to know, Mike, do you think next year house prices should increase at all?
But yeah, Kat's got the question here, but feel free, Mike.
But I do thank Max for the question, and I might come back to it. But in answer to your question, as I said during my speech, if the New South Wales Productivity Commission boss, who Max is fond of quoting, is saying that a 10% increase in the supply around the country is going to drive down house prices by 25%, that first, second and third is where the leverage is. That's what we need to do. We actually have a massive housing task ahead of us. And if I describe to you in any detail how difficult it is to build on the urban fringe, you would understand why, in addition to the $2 or $3 that every government takes out of your pocket when you buy, for every $10 that you spend a new house, if you add that to the fact that there are 16 gateways on a peri-urban master plan development, which are massively overlaid and complicated and take between 5 and 10 years to resolve, you wonder where the cost base for a new house comes from. It's those two things in the main. It's government taxes and charges and hideously inefficient planning systems. Not that are not required, but are inefficient, often counteract each other, interrupt the different gateways, and frankly are just too slow. And I can tell you that there are housing ministers, planning ministers around this country who are sitting on development approvals right now that they could release very, very easily and make a really material difference to supply. But it's a very difficult and slow process. So I want to say that. What was your question?
Do you think house prices should go up next year?
Well, I don't think they will if we do the things that I pointed out in my 9-point plan.
So your 9-point plan, you're comfortable with house prices not going up as much if there was actually more action by state governments, or not going up at all?
The desirable outcome is a highly competitive market, which in terms of supply we do have. Like, there's a lot of providers. The UK has just done a similar study to the one that we could easily do here and find the same answer, which is there is nothing whatsoever to the idea that developers land bank. It is absolute rubbish. They produced this is the CMA in February. They absolutely pilloried the idea that there was. It's just not a thing. And then if you go ahead and you do all the other stuff, you're going to bring down those prices.
Next question is from Paul Karp.
Thanks very much. Tom had a long list of practical objections to this, and you gave a very general answer, Max. So I want to take you to 2 of them specifically, please. First, given the evils of land banking, are you in favour of compulsory acquisition of land? And secondly, how do you get the states on board for a proposal that involves them waiving their land taxes and possibly also relying on their constitutional authority?
Well, firstly, the PBO costing includes a commercial cost of land and housing construction. So under that costing, the government could just go out and buy commercial land at a commercial price. I would note, though, there's a lot of public land in inner cities that keeps being sold off and given to private property developers. There's a massive hectare sites in my electorate that's happened. We know the Victorian government is giving up a lot of public land right now over to developers. The first thing we can do is stop selling off public land to private property developers and keep that and use it to build good quality housing. And your second question?
How are you going to get the states on board?
Yeah, so this would be the federal government going to the states and saying, we want to invest tens of billions of dollars building good quality homes, reducing your public housing wait lists, reducing expenditure on healthcare and education problems that come with housing stress. I would be very surprised if the states then turned around and said, no, we don't want tens of billions of dollars investment in good quality housing in our states that reduces all the extraneous costs that come with massive housing stress in those states and territories. Like their health budget would decrease, their education budget would decrease because they'd be spending less money on dealing with catching people at the bottom of the cliff, and much more money stopping people from getting into housing stress in the first place. And we know that improves health and education outcomes.
And just to follow up on that question, Mike, if you want to respond to this issue about compulsory acquisition or land banking, but I thought I'd also add another question in there on the same theme. In the resources sector, governments have sometimes said to big companies that have leases over projects that they don't develop, you've got to use it or lose it. You know, if you don't develop it within a certain period of time, you just can't have that. I mean, do you think that would be acceptable in the property business? If you don't use that property to start building homes, you lose some kind of right over it, or you face some kind of sanction to get you to hurry up and move on.
I think that's playing around the edges, as I've said. There are massive, massive sources of potential supply that are not being activated. If you look at the supply of apartments, for example, there are only half as many apartments likely to be built in the next 12 months as were being built back in 2018. There's a combination of factors involved in that. High cost of capital is one of them, but there are many others. Those things take 5 to 7 years to get out of the ground in the best possible circumstances. Again, with land on the edge, you know, new master plan communities, it's a 5 to 10 year process with the most egregious delays you can imagine on the ground level that really do massively drive up the cost for the end user. That is the only place that you are going to make a material difference to this. And it's not the result of some dystopian conspiracy, which is my use of the word dystopian, about the conspiracy of state governments in order to achieve this outcome. Of course they're not intending to do that. This is the rank incompetence of previous governments and parliaments in that regard, failing to unlock that supply, failing to anticipate population growth.
Which is mainly state government?
Mainly.
Yeah. Next question is from Ellen Ransley.
Ellen Ransley from NCA Newswire. Thank you both. I've got a question for each of you. Max, I've got one more specific question from Tom's long list. You said in your speech, you know, there's 30% of these homes will be available to purchase.
Yep.
They won't be means tested though. Mm-hmm. How is it fair that a couple earning $250,000 a year trying to get into the property market can buy one of these homes on the same footing that somebody earning $70,000 a year might be? And Mr. Zorbas, just to you, Max implied that property developers were slowly drip feeding. Is there more that property developers should be doing to open more of those lots up now?
Okay, do you want me to go first? Yeah, we deliberately have not means tested this policy because in the same way that anyone can walk into a public hospital or anyone can go to a public school, we do want a public option for housing where anyone is able to live in that. And that's the beauty of universalism. It underpins our public healthcare system. It underpins our public education system precisely because someone on a higher income might live next door to a nurse or a cleaner. Now, what that does is increase the amount of revenue that public property developer earns that can be put back into building more housing. In a lot of European countries, there are almost no income thresholds to access that housing. And what it means is they generate way more in rental income, even if it is capped. So that's, I think, a really desirable outcome. And it also turns it into a social good and a social right. That means if someone, say, is earning that amount of money, knows that at some point they could get access to it, it also makes it more politically sustainable. Because then people know, hey, I have an interest in this working. I have an interest in the public hospitals working because eventually I'll need to be using them. But what's happened to public housing is the first thing governments did to justify cutting it was restrict who got to access it. That's exactly how governments degrade public services, because first they'd restrict who accesses it. Then they say, well, less people are using it now and less people are lining up for it. And, you know, you don't really want to use it. And, it's concentrated in disadvantage, so we'll cut funding for it. And then they go from there. And the way to restore this is a proud thing, like Housing Commission used to be, is to say, you shouldn't be ashamed of moving into this, you should be proud. And I think that's where this country should go.
Mike?
Your question was around land banking again. So, in reality, land banking is not a thing. These are highly capital intensive processes. They're often delayed by a whole range of things, some of them legitimate, as I've said, some of them just down to rank inefficiency that needs to be radically overhauled in order to increase supply and drive down the cost of housing and the cost of renting and the cost of everything else in the housing supply market. So when you look at where this has been studied, and I must say, Max, you have been remarkably evidence-free on your land banking spiels to date, so I'm really hoping there'll be some more questions about where are you getting this evidence from, because there isn't any in Australia. But when they look at this in the UK, what they recently find, looking at very similar greenfields markets to our own, is that there is no land banking. These are highly competitive, often fragmented growth corridors. They're often competing organisations there, and they have to pay back investors. They have to pay back with interest. These are highly cash flow oriented businesses.
But
and
don't Australians see that in their ordinary life? Not maybe on the edges of the cities where there's open space to be developed, but in the areas closer to the CBD where they might see a vacant block that's sitting there waiting because, of course, the developer has got to get around to then putting up the project, got to get the labour, got to get the materials, got to fit it into the investment time frame. I mean, some people might call that land banking. Isn't it just waiting to maximise the profit?
Look, I think in a lot of, but in a lot of those circumstances, you are looking at a situation where it's an individual. So they've got a block, and they've got to save in order to be able to capitalise on that block, in order to be able to build something there, which presumably they would then rent out as an investment property. Now, that is a very aspirational thing to do and incredibly common. I see it around me in Melbourne on a regular basis. But that is a process of saving, not unlike having superannuation.
But that's just because you asked me, move on. Precisely the problem, though, Mike. That's when a developer saves and holds on to all of that land, like AV Jennings, with 11,000 lots of land that have planning approval to build homes, and then only sell 723 every year. Well, if they can't build on the other 11,000, they should give them up to people who can. And so that's precise. Yeah, that's what is driving.
Mike's reply? What's your reply to that? Is AV Jennings land banking in that?
No, they're not. No, there are 16 gateways, at least, in any kind of master plan community like this. So there's 8 before you get to what you would describe as an approval, and then there's 8 after. There's engineering works, there's agency concurrences, there's electrical, there's power, there's sewerage, there's water. And all of those agencies around the country are incredibly slow at doing what they do by comparison to what they could be in the right circumstances. And that is the problem.
Next question is from Julie Hare.
Julie Hare from the AFR. Thank you both. I'd like to ask you both the same question. There's a bit of debate as to how much migration, in particular international students, are contributing to particularly the rental crisis. I would like to know your thoughts on that and whether migration levels should be reduced even more as a means to solving this problem.
There's a reason that every time we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis where people are doing it tough, that the rich and powerful bring up migrants. Because it is an excellent way for people like Peter Dutton to distract from the real culprits of this cost of living and housing crisis. Massive profits for the banks, massive profits for property developers, massive profits for property investors. The reality is that we could build enough housing for people coming to this country. We could phase out the tax handouts, screwing over renters trying to buy a home. We could put caps on rent increases. And we could raise taxes on big corporations and use that to ensure everyone who comes to this country has the resources to live a good life. But who would lose out of that? Property investors, big banks, large corporations who get away with without paying any tax. And I think we should live in a country where we're proud of multiculturalism, where we don't use it as a scapegoat and migrants coming to this country as a scapegoat for a crisis they had nothing to do with.
The government stated... The government's stated policy is to bring net overseas migration down from around 518,000 down to below 300,000. Are you okay with that, just on the overall goal?
Well, I saw the Housing Minister get up in Parliament and her response to one of the Liberals' questions on migration was, oh, well, under you there'd be even more migration. And now we're seeing this race to the bottom from the major parties around migration, precisely because it's a useful distraction from the real cause of the cost of living and housing crisis. It sucks up oxygen, where we get trapped talking about and demonising migrants when we should be talking about what will actually fix this crisis, which is building enough good quality government homes to live in, capping rents, scrapping the tax handouts for property investors that are denying millions of renters the chance to buy a home.
What do you think, Mike?
Well, I certainly think I want to read you that thing about rent caps, which is so damaging. What I think about immigration is it's an incredibly positive part of our society. It's been a huge beneficial input to our growth as a nation since the Second World War, massively positive. I would say always that as you look at the immigration mix, you've got to be smart about that. So if you think about construction and many of the real, if you like, headwinds that face building an affordable house these days, one of them is the fact that over the last 20 years, only 1.8% of the people that have come into this country have been hypothecated into construction trades. That's an incredibly low number out of the total number. So my inclination would be to say to both major parties, when you're setting your policies, make sure you're getting the mix right. We probably need to more than double that intake of construction trades. And I'll give you one example. In Victoria, by 2034, to build all the things they want to build, they need 191,000 extra construction trades workers. Now, we haven't put on that sort of number across the rest of the country over a decade period at various decades in the last couple of cycles. So we are going to need to do something quite extraordinary, in addition to all the laudable TAFE and other education and training that's going on, to boost the number of people doing that, as part probably of intelligently managing down the overall envelope, which seems to be on track.
Thank you.
And our last question is from David Denham, which will give you both a chance to sum up, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So David,
Denham
last
from
question.
Preview Magazine. Thank you for your presentations today. I've got a question for each of you. First of all, to the Greens, we cannot keep our population forever rising, because if we're going to be sustainable with a land of the driest continent with people living in. So what is the policy of the Greens? Because this is, the number of people migrating into the country does affect the housing crisis. And the second, and the question there to the other speaker, surely negative gearing, it's rather like Matthew chapter whatever it is, to those that have shall be given, and those that have nothing shall be taken away. So it's favouring the wealthy. And the only reason it's there, surely, is to stop the price of property going up.
You go first, Mike?
Yeah, why not? So thank you for your question, as the other speaker. I genuinely disagree with you on negative gearing. There's no question that if you remove it, and we did the modelling with Deloitte in changes that were proposed at the 2019 election, you knock 4% off the supply of new housing straight away. No ifs, no buts. That is a busted flush as far as policy goes. Now, I notice that's not the policy of either the Labor Party or the Libs at the national level. I think it's very important that we keep that in mind. It's a lot of construction jobs. It's about 8,000 construction jobs you lose. You lose about 1.5 billion off GDP. And when you think about what's to gain there, there's not actually a lot to gain there. Around about 79% of people who are negatively geared only own one home. So this is often, again, a retirement strategy for people in lieu of super. Often it involves their super. You know, this is not some complicated, vast, problematic area. It is nowhere near as mainstream, for example, as wholesale reform of the GST with a 15% better floors and buffers, looking after the disadvantaged, as proposed by people like Ken Henry. It's, definitely a third order issue as far as supply goes. That is the thing that will drive down house prices in this country. Supply, supply, supply.
Max?
Just on negative gearing and capital gains, all it does is lock renters and first home buyers out of ever being able to buy a home. Now, talk about supply, 83% of all property investment goes on existing dwellings. Now, if its goal is supply, that's an 83% fail rate. But what we do know is what's happened since the capital gains tax discount was introduced is that house prices have skyrocketed. In fact, every year after it was introduced, house prices went up almost 3 times that of wages. I'm going to have to agree to disagree with you on, disagree with the premise of the question. I don't think that migration is the primary cause of the housing crisis. I think we've gone through that today. But look, in broad terms, I sit here as one of the only renters in Parliament. And we heard today previously that, there's a lot of politicians here who don't come from these housing construction or developer experiences. Well, 30% of this country rents. And I'm one of the only ones in Parliament who rents. And every day I come into Parliament and I argue for things like stopping single mums from being evicted because they can't afford the rent by just putting a cap on rent increases, which has worked in Australia before and around the world. It works for renters, it doesn't work for property investors. I talk about building enough public housing so someone who has been waiting for 10 years, sometimes living out of their cars with a family, can move into a home. Talk about the fact that for my entire generation, we have been told that we are just going to get thrown to the wolves, that neither government is going to tax handouts for property investors. That even though I know that the Prime Minister was able to buy a home in Marrickville for $146,000, about 5 times the average wage, now if I was to go and try and buy a house in Marrickville, it'd be $2 million, 20 times the average wage. This is such a serious crisis, and all we're doing is tinkering around the edges. What? More power for property developers. Keep the tax handouts. Don't cap rents. Don't build any more public housing, or certainly not as much as the Greens are proposing. Well, I'll tell you where that leads. More of the same. And more of the same is me speaking to more single mums like I did over the weekend, who, with tears in her eyes, talked about the fact that she was having to skip meals so her baby didn't get nappy rash. I don't think that's sustainable. And let me tell you, there's a lot more people like me around this country who aren't in Parliament. Young renters, angry, upset with the political class that has me sitting here as a renter debating the head of the Property Council about solving the housing crisis. How did we get here? And I think over the next few years, the entire political class is going to find out what happens when you ignore the 1/3 of this country getting screwed over by a housing system that funnels billions of dollars into the people that don't need it right now, like the banks and property investors.
Well, as I said at the start, it's one of the biggest issues in Australia, housing. We certainly heard a lot of passion today. Thank you both for your remarks today and for taking the questions. I think it was a very well-mannered discussion, so maybe you should shake hands and, you may disagree, but